Okay, so today I'm going to read from this book, Oliver Sacks' Musicophilia, and it's on chapter 16. And it's called Speech and Song Aphasia and Music Therapy. Samuel S. developed severe expressive aphasia following a stroke in his late 60s, and he remained totally speechless, unable to retrieve a single word despite intensive speech therapy 2 years later. The break for him came when Connie Tomayano, the music therapist at our hospital, heard him singing one day outside her clinic. He was singing Old Man River, very tunefully and with great feeling, but only getting 2 or 3 words out of the song. Even though speech therapy had been given up with Samuel, who was by then regarded as hopeless, Connie felt that music therapy might be helpful. She started to meet with him 3 times a week for half-an-hour sessions in which she would sing with him or accompany him on the accordion. Mr. S. was soon able to sing along with Connie to get all the words out of Old Man River, and then of many other ballads and songs he had learned growing up in the 1940s. And as he did this, he started to show the beginnings of speech. Within 2 months, he was making short but appropriate responses to questions. For instance, if one of us asked Mr. S. about his weekend at home, he could reply, "Had a great time," or "Saw the kids." Neurologists often refer to a speech area in the premotor zone of the brain dominant, usually left, frontal lobe. Damage to a particular part of this area, an area first identified by French neurologist Paul Broca in 1862, whether from a degenerative disease, a stroke, or a brain injury, may produce expressive aphasia, a loss of spoken language. In 1873, Carl Wernicke had described a different speech area in the left temporal lobe. Damage to this area was apt to produce difficulty understanding speech, a receptive aphasia. It was also recognized at much the same time that brain damage could produce disturbances of musical expression or appreciation, amusias, and that while some patients might suffer from both an aphasia and an amusia, others could have aphasia without amusia. We are linguistic species. We turn to language to express whatever we are thinking, and it's usually there for us instantly. But for those with aphasia, the inability to communicate verbally may be almost unbearably frustrating and isolating. To make matters worse, they are often treated by others as idiots, almost non-persons, because they cannot speak. Much of this can change with the discovery that such patients can sing not only tunes, but the words of operas, hymns, or songs. Suddenly, their disability, their cut-offness, seems much less. And though singing is not propositional communication, it is very basic existential communication. It not only says, "I am alive, I am here," but may express thoughts and feelings that cannot be expressed at this point by speech. Being able to sing words can be a great reassurance to such patients, showing them that their language capacities are not irretrievably lost, that the words are still in them somewhere, even though it may take music to bring them out. Whenever I see patients with expressive aphasia, I sing happy birthday to them. Virtually all of them, often to their own astonishment, start to join in, singing the tune. About half of them will also get the words. Speech itself is not just a succession of words in the proper order. It has inflections, intonations, tempo, rhythm, and melody. Language and music both depend on phonotory, in articulatory mechanisms that are rudimentary to other primates, and both depend, for their appreciation, on distinctly human brain mechanisms dedicated to the analysis of complex, segmented, rapidly changing streams of sounds. And yet, there are major differences and some overlaps in the representation of speech and song in the brain. Patients with so-called non-fluent aphasia not only have an impairment of vocabulary and grammar, but have forgotten or lost the feeling of the rhythm and inflections of speech, hence the broken and musical telegraphic style of their speech, to the extent that they still have any words available. It is such patients who, as a rule, do best with music therapy and who feel most excited when they are able to sing lyrics. For in doing so, they discover not only that words are still available to them, but that the flow of speech is also accessible, though bound apparently to the flow of the song. This may also be the case with a different form of aphasia, so-called dynamic aphasia, where it is not the structure of the sentence that is affected, but the initiation of speech. Patients with dynamic aphasia may speak very sparingly, not yet produce syntactically correct sentences, on the rare occasion when they do speak. Jason Warren et al. Described how an elderly man with mild frontal lobe degeneration and extreme dynamic aphasia was nonetheless unimpaired in musical initiative. He played piano, could read and write music. He took part in a weekly singing group. He was also able to recite, as Warren et al. Noted. He was able to read a passage chosen at random from the Torah, using the heightened intonation, distinct from both singing and ordinary reading, reserved for reading out loud. Many aphasic patients can get not only the words of songs, but can learn to repeat sequences or series, days of the week, months of the year, numerals, etc. They may be able to do this as a series, but not to dissemble a particular item from the series. So one of my patients, for instance, can recite all the months of the year in order, January, February, March, April, May, etc. He knows what the current month is, but when I ask him, he cannot respond simply April. Indeed, aphasics may be able to reproduce much more elaborate familiar sentences, a prayer or lines from Shakespeare or an entire poem, but only as automated sequences. Such sequences unfold once they are started in much the same way as music does. Huggins Jackson long ago distinguished propositional speech from what he called variously emotional or automatic speech, stressing that the latter could be preserved in aphasia, sometimes to a startling extent, even when the former was grossly impaired. Cursing is often cited as dramatic form of automatic speech, but singing familiar lyrics can be seen as equally automatic. A person with aphasia may be able to sing or curse or recite a poem, but not to utter a propositional phrase. The question of whether singing has any use in the recovery of speech, then, can be formulated another way. Can language, embedded in unconscious automation, be released for conscious propositional use? During the Second World War, A.R. Luria began to investigate the neurobasis of speech and language of different forms of aphasia and of methods of restoring speech. His work was published in Russian in a massive monograph, Traumatic Aphasia, in 1947, and in a small, startling book, Restoration of Function After Brain Injury, in 1948, though neither was translated or known to the West until several decades later. Given an acute injury to the brain, such as he saw in the stroke patients or injured soldiers he studied, Luria emphasized there would always be two levels of disturbance. First, there was a core of tissue destruction, which was irreversible, and second, a larger surrounding area, or penumbra, of depressed or inhibited functions, which under certain conditions he felt might be reversible. When one first meets a patient immediately after a stroke or a head injury, one sees only the total effect of injury, paralysis, aphasia, or other disabilities. It is difficult to distinguish disabilities produced by anatomical damage from those produced by inhibitions of the surrounding neural tissue. Time will show the difference in most patients, for inhibition tends to lift spontaneously, usually in a matter of weeks. But in some patients, for reasons that are still not clear, it does not. At this point, if not before, it is crucial to start therapy to promote what Luria call de-inhibition. Speech therapy may lead to de-inhibition, but it may sometimes fail. If it fails, one may wrongly assume that the patient's aphasia is due to permanent anatomical damage, and it is thus irreversible. But music therapy for some patients can succeed where conventional speech therapy has failed, as in the case of Samuel S. It may be that cortical areas previously inhibited but not destroyed can be de-inhibited, kick-started into action by re-experiencing language, even if it is a wholly automated sort, language embedded in music. A very crucial aspect of speech or music therapy for the aphasic patient is the relationship between therapist and patient. Luria emphasized that the origin of speech was social, no less than neurological. It required the interaction of mother and child. It is likely that the same is true for song. And in this sense, music therapy for patients with aphasia is profoundly different from music therapy for movement disorder, like Parkinsonism. In Parkinsonism, it is the motor system which is being activated almost automatically by music, and a tape or a CD, in this limited sense, can do as much as a therapist. But with speech disorders like aphasia, the therapist and her relationship with the patient, a relationship which involves not only musical and vocal interaction, but physical contact, gesture, imitation of movement, and prosody, is an essential part of the therapy. This intimate working together, this working in tandem, depends on mirror neurons throughout the brain, which enables the patient not only to imitate, but to incorporate the actions or abilities of others, as Rizzolatti et al. Have explored. The therapist not only provides support and an encouraging presence, but literally leads the patient into more and more complex forms of speech. With Samuel S., this involvement drawing language out until he could sing all the words of Oman River, then leading him on to sing a whole range of old songs, then by the right sort of questions, drawing him into short, responsive phrases. Whether there is a chance of going beyond this, of restoring fluent narrative or propositional speech to patients with long-standing aphasia, remains an open question. Saying, "had a great time," or "saw the kids," may be as far as Samuel S. can go. It might be said that such verbal responses are modest, limited, and formulaic, but they do represent a radical advance from purely automated speech, and they can have an enormous effect on the daily reality of an aphasic person's life, allowing a formerly mute and isolated person to re-enter a verbal world, a world he had seemingly lost forever. In 1973, Martin Albert and his colleagues in Boston described a form of music therapy they called melodic intonation therapy. Patients were taught to sing or intone short phrases, for example, "How are you?" Then the music element of this were removed slowly until, in some cases, the patient regained the power to speak a little without the aid of intonation. One 67-year-old man, aphasic for 18 months, he could only produce meaningless grunts and had received 3 months of speech therapy without effect. He started to produce words 2 days after beginning melodic intonation therapy. In 2 weeks, he had an effective vocabulary of 100 words. At 6 weeks, he could carry on short, meaningful conversation. What is happening in the brain when melodic intonation or any type of music therapy works? Albert et al. Originally thought that it served to activate areas in the right hemisphere, areas homologous to Broca's areas. Albert's close colleague, Norman Geschwind, had been fascinated by the way in which children could recover speech and language even after the removal of the entire left hemisphere of the brain. This was sometimes done in children with uncontrollable seizures. Such a recovery or reacquisition of language suggested to Geschwind that though linguistic abilities were generally associated with the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere also had linguistic potential and could take over language functions almost completely, at least in children. Albert and his colleagues thus felt, without clear evidence, that this might be the case, at least to some degree, even in aphasic adults, and that melodic intonation therapy, calling as it did upon right hemisphere musical skills, could help to develop this potential. Detailed imaging of patients undergoing MIT, melodic intonation therapy, was not possible during the 1970s. In a 1996 PET scan study by Pascal Bellin et al. Seemed to show that there was no activation in the right hemisphere for such patients. They reported, moreover, that there was not only an inhibition of Broca's area in aphasia patients, but hyperactivity of the homologous area in the right hemisphere. We may call it for convenience the right Broca's area. This sustained hyperactivity on the right side exerts an active inhibiting action on the good Broca's area, which in its weakened state is powerless to resist. So the right hemisphere, the hyperactivity in the right hemisphere can inhibit the left hemisphere, which in its weakened state, if it's already weakened, then it's powerless to resist. The challenge then is not only to stimulate the normal left Broca's area, but to find a way to damp down the right Broca's area with its malignant hyperactivity. Singing and melodic intonation seem to do exactly that. By engaging the right hemisphere circuits in normal activity, they disengage them from pathological activity. This process has a certain self-sustaining momentum of its own, for as the left Broca's area is released from inhibition, it can exert a suppressant action on the right Broca's area. A vicious cycle. In short, it is replaced by a therapeutic one. For various reasons, little research attention was paid during the 1980s and 1990s to melodic intonation therapy for people with severe, non-fluent Broca's aphasia, or to the mechanisms which it might work. Nonetheless, music therapists continued to observe that in many cases such therapy could allow very significant improvement. Recent work by Gottfried Schloh and his colleagues carefully documented the brain activity of 8 patients undergoing melodic intonation therapy. This involves 75 sessions of intensive therapy. All of these patients, Schloh et al. Report, showed significant changes in speech output measures and in a right hemispheric frontotemporal network while repeating simple words, phrases in the MRI scanner. Schloh showed me a number of videos of such patients, and the change in their ability to speak was indeed striking. Initially, many were incapable of even responding clearly to the question, "What is your address?" Following MIT, they were able to reply much more easily to such questions, even offering additional details beyond those asked. They had clearly achieved at least a measure of propositional speech. These changes, both behavioral and anatomical, were retained even several months after the course of treatment had ended. As Schloh points out, the neural process that underlie post-stroke language recovery remains largely unknown and thus have not been specifically targeted by most aphasia therapies. But melodic intonation therapy, at least, has been shown to be ideally suited for facilitating language recovery in non-fluent aphasian patients, particularly in those with large left hemispheric lesions, for whom the only route to recovery may be the engagement of the right hemispheric language regions. We have become accustomed in the last 20 years or so to dramatic revelations of cortical plasticity. Auditory cortex, it has been shown, can be reallocated for visual processing in congenially deaf people. And the visual cortex in blind people may be recruited for auditory and tactile functions. But perhaps even more remarkable in this notion is that the right hemisphere, which in normal circumstances has only most rudimentary linguistic capacities, can be turned into a reasonably efficient linguistic organ with less than 3 months of training, and that music is the key to this transformation.